For years I couldn't understand why every job interview ended the same way. The manager would smile when I walked in. They would shake my hand. Sometimes they'd even say my resume looked impressive, and then something would change. A pause. A look I couldn't quite read. Then the same question every time. Is there something in your background we should know about? At first I thought it was normal. Background checks. Company policy. Routine questions. But after the 5th interview, the 6th, the 10th, I started to realize something wasn't right. Because every single employer seemed to already know something about me. Something I had never done. Something that didn't exist. Someone had been calling them, warning them not to hire me. Telling them I was dangerous. And the worst part, the calls weren't coming from strangers. They were coming from my own parents. For 3 years, every time I applied for a job, my parents contacted the company first. They told managers I had a violent past, that I had been in trouble with the law, that hiring me would be a mistake. By the time I turned 27, my reputation had been destroyed in towns I had never even visited. No one would hire me. No one would listen to me. And no one believed the truth. Until the day a lawyer opened my parents' inbox and read one email in court. An email they never expected anyone to see. But before I tell you what was written in that email, you need to understand how it all started. I grew up in a town small enough that everyone knew each other's business before breakfast. Harland, Ohio had one grocery store, one high school, and a diner where the same waitress had been pouring coffee for 30 years. People liked it that way. Quiet. Predictable. My parents loved it most of all. From the outside, our family looked normal. My father, Gerald Johansson, worked as a plant manager for nearly 2 decades. My mother, Denise, volunteered at church events and food drives. People called them good people. But inside our house, things worked a little differently. Rules were everywhere. Not written rules. The quiet kind. The kind that slowly shape your life without you noticing. I didn't have my own house key until I was 19. My parents said it was safer that way. I wasn't allowed to drive farther than 10 miles without telling my father exactly where I was going. My mother checked my email accounts, just to make sure no one strange contacted me. At the time, I thought it was normal. Parents worry about their kids, that's what everyone told me. But the rules never stopped. Even after I turned 25, I had graduated at the top of my class in high school. My guidance counselor once told me I could earn scholarships if I applied to the right colleges. When I brought the brochures home, my father didn't even open them. He set them on the kitchen counter and said something I'll never forget. College is for people who don't know how to work. That was the end of the conversation. Instead, I stayed home. I helped my mother around the house. I cooked most of the meals. I cleaned. I mowed the lawn. And every time I mentioned wanting a job somewhere outside Harland, my father would shake his head. The world isn't safe, he'd say. You don't understand how people are. For a long time, I believed him. But the week after my 25th birthday, something changed. It wasn't dramatic, no argument, no big fight, just a quiet moment in the kitchen. I was standing at the sink, scrubbing the same cast iron skillet I'd been washing since I was a teenager. Sunlight came through the window over the sink, and suddenly a thought crossed my mind. If nothing changes, I'm going to be 40 years old doing this exact same thing. That thought scared me more than anything my parents had ever said. The next morning, I walked to the Harland Public Library. It was the only place in town with public computers. The keyboards were sticky, the chairs were uncomfortable, and the internet was slow enough to test anyone's patience. But it was the first place I could make a decision without my parents watching. I created a new email address, one they didn't know about. Then I searched for job openings in nearby towns. Most listings required experience I didn't have, but one caught my attention. A hardware store in Millfield. Full-time sales associate. Benefits after 90 days. It was 20 minutes away. Far enough to feel like freedom. My fingers trembled as I filled out the application. Name. Address. Phone number. When I reached the final button, I hesitated. If my parents found out, they'd be furious. But something inside me pushed past the fear. I clicked submit. 2 days later, an email arrived. They wanted to interview me. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. I read the message 3 times just to be sure. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. That night at dinner, my parents seemed strangely quiet. My father kept glancing at me over his newspaper. My mother washed dishes that were already clean. Neither of them asked about my day. But the tension at the table felt heavy. The next morning, I drove to Millfield for the interview. The manager greeted me at the door with a friendly handshake. His name was Bill. He seemed kind, professional. The kind of person who actually listens when you speak. For the first few minutes, the interview went perfectly. We talked about customer service, inventory work, store hours. Then Bill leaned back in his chair, his smile faded slightly, and he asked a question that made my stomach tighten. "Caroline," he said carefully, "is there anything in your background we should know about?" I frowned. "No, sir." He hesitated. Then he sighed. "We received a phone call yesterday," he said. "A woman claiming to be a neighbor warned us about you." My heartbeat started to race. What did she say? Bill looked uncomfortable. He rubbed his forehead before answering. "She said you had a violent past, and that hiring you might be dangerous." For a moment, the entire room felt like it was spinning. "That's not true," I said quickly. "I've never been arrested. I've never hurt anyone." Bill nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. "But a business has to be careful." The interview ended 5 minutes later. I drove home in silence. When I pulled into the driveway, my father was sitting on the porch reading his newspaper. He didn't even look up. "How was your day?" he asked calmly. I stared at him. Something about the question felt strange. Like he already knew the answer. "Fine," I said quietly. He turned a page in the newspaper. "Good," he replied. At the time, I told myself it was just a coincidence. But 6 weeks later, after 3 more interviews ended exactly the same way, I began to realize something terrifying. Someone was calling every employer before I could even get hired. And slowly, painfully, I started to suspect who it might be. After the hardware store interview, I tried to convince myself it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe someone confused me with another person. Maybe the manager had misheard something. Small towns are full of rumors, and sometimes rumors travel faster than the truth. That's what I told myself. For 2 days, I replayed the conversation with Bill over and over in my head. "A neighbor warned us about you. A violent past. Dangerous." The words didn't make sense. I had never been in trouble with the police. I barely even argued with people. By the 3rd day, I decided the only thing I could do was try again. So I went back to the library. The same sticky keyboard, the same slow internet. But this time I searched farther away. If someone in Harland had said something about me, maybe it wouldn't follow me to another town. I found a job listing at a grocery store in Ridgeway, nearly 30 miles away. Stock clerk. Evening shifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I sent the application and forced myself not to think about it. 3 days later, my phone rang. The manager wanted to schedule an interview. Tuesday afternoon, I remember sitting in the driver's seat of my car before going in, staring at the store's automatic doors. This was my second chance. A clean start. No one here knew me. No one knew my parents. Inside, the store smelled like fresh bread and floor cleaner. The manager, a woman named Carol, greeted me with a warm smile. She walked me to a small office behind the customer service desk. "Your application looks great," she said as she skimmed through the printed pages. "You've had experience working at the diner in Harland." I nodded. "For years." "Good," she said. "We like hiring people who already know how to work with customers." For a few minutes, everything felt normal. We talked about schedules, weekend availability, heavy lifting in the stockroom. Then Carol stopped mid-sentence. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just a small shift. The kind that would be easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She folded her hands on the desk. "Caroline," she said carefully. "Yes, I need to ask you something." A familiar unease crept into my stomach. "Okay. Have you ever had any legal trouble?" My throat went dry. "No," I said immediately. None at all. Carol studied my face for a moment. Then she sighed. That's what I thought. My heart skipped. What do you mean? We received a call this morning, she said. Someone claiming to know you personally. The room felt suddenly smaller. What did they say? Carol hesitated. They said you had a history of violent behavior. I stared at her. I don't. I believe you, she said quickly. But when someone calls with that kind of warning, we have to take it seriously. The conversation ended almost exactly the same way the hardware store interview had ended. Polite, professional, and final. When I walked out of the grocery store, I felt something different from the first interview. The first time, I had been confused. This time, I was afraid. Because two separate employers had heard the same story, the same accusation. That wasn't coincidence. Someone was telling people this. And whoever it was knew exactly where I was applying. I drove home slowly, my hands tight on the steering wheel. When I pulled into the driveway, my father was standing near the garage. He wiped his hands with a rag as I stepped out of the car. Another interview today, he asked casually. I froze. I mentioned it yesterday, I said carefully. He nodded. How did it go? The question felt almost rehearsed, like he was testing something. I replied. My father studied me for a moment, then he smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. You know, he said. Some people just aren't ready for the world outside their home. I didn't answer. I went inside and closed the door behind me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. 2 interviews, 2 warnings, both from someone claiming to know me, someone who knew exactly where I had applied. There were only a handful of people who had that information, and most of them lived under the same roof I did. I pushed the thought away. Parents don't sabotage their own children, they just don't. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But the next week, I applied to 2 more places. A warehouse near the county line, and a diner in Cooperton that needed a morning shift hostess. The warehouse never called me back. But the diner did. The owner was a woman named Pat. She asked me to stop by on Thursday afternoon. When I walked in, the diner was nearly empty. Pat waved me toward the counter. You must be Caroline, she said kindly. Yes, Mom. She poured me a glass of water before speaking again. Honey, she said quietly, I need to ask you something. My stomach dropped. The same question. The same tension. But this time, Pat didn't hide anything. Someone called here yesterday, she said. What did they say? Pat lowered her voice. They said you had a criminal history. My hands tightened around the glass. That's not true. I figured as much, she replied. But they sounded convincing. She hesitated before adding something that made my heart sink. It was a woman. A woman. Someone claiming to be concerned. Someone warning employers not to hire me. I drove home slowly that afternoon. By the time I pulled into the driveway, a terrible possibility had started forming in my mind. One I didn't want to believe. That night, long after my parents had gone to bed, I walked quietly down the hallway. My mother kept a small desk in her sewing room. It was usually locked. But that night, the drawer was slightly open. Inside, under a stack of fabric patterns, I found a small blue notebook. At first, it looked ordinary. Just a list of names written in neat handwriting. Then I read the names more carefully. Millfield Hardware, Ridgeway Market, Cooperton Family Diner, every place I had applied for a job. Next to each name was a red check mark. My chest tightened. My hands started shaking. Because suddenly, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was staring at proof. Someone had been tracking every job I applied to. And whoever wrote that list had been making the phone calls. For a long time, I just stood there in the sewing room holding that blue notebook. The house was completely silent. My parents' bedroom door was closed down the hall. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked softly. But inside my head, everything felt loud. Millfield Hardware, Ridgeway Market, Cooperton Family Diner, every single place I had applied for a job. Next to each name was a neat red check mark. My mother's handwriting careful, precise, the same handwriting she used on birthday cards. And suddenly every strange interview, every awkward conversation, every rejection made sense. Someone had been calling those employers before I even arrived. Someone who knew exactly where I had applied. My parents. The thought made my stomach twist. Parents don't do that, they just don't. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I closed the notebook and carefully slid it back into the drawer. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The walls suddenly felt smaller. For the first time in my life, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a trap. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I waited. Morning came slowly. The smell of coffee drifted down the hallway around 7 o'clock. The same as every day, my father always woke up first. He made coffee, he read the newspaper, he waited for breakfast. Routine. Everything in our house was routine. I walked into the kitchen holding the blue notebook. My mother stood at the counter pouring coffee. My father sat at the table with his newspaper open. They both looked up when I entered. "Morning," my father said. I placed the notebook on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was louder than I expected. My mother froze. Coffee spilled over the rim of the mug she was holding. My father asked calmly. "You tell me," I said. Neither of them spoke. My mother's eyes locked onto the notebook. Her face turned pale. "You've been calling my employers," I continued. Silence filled the kitchen. Finally, my mother spoke. "You went through my things." Her voice trembled, but not the way I expected, not with guilt. With anger. "You lied about me?" I said. "You told people I was dangerous." "I was protecting you," she snapped. My father slowly folded his newspaper. "Dennis," he said quietly. But my mother ignored him. "The world outside this house is dangerous," she continued. "You don't understand how people take advantage of girls like you." "I'm 25, I said. "That doesn't mean you're ready. You told employers I had a criminal record." "I told them to be careful," she corrected. My father leaned back in his chair. "You shouldn't have looked through your mother's things," he said. That was all. No denial, no apology, just criticism. "You've been ruining my chances at getting a job," I said. "You don't need a job," he replied calmly. "I need independence." A short, quiet sound. "You already have everything you need," he said. "You have a roof, food, family, and control," I added. The word hung in the air. For the first time, my father's expression hardened. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being honest." My mother wiped her eyes. "You don't understand how dangerous people can be," she whispered. "I'm trying to protect you. Be destroying my reputation. You're safe here," my father said firmly. "That's what matters." Something inside me broke at that moment. Not loudly. Just quietly, like a thread snapping after years of being pulled too tight. "If you keep doing this," I said slowly, "I'm leaving." My father didn't blink. "You walk out that with nothing. I'll manage." "You won't," he replied. His voice was calm, certain. "You don't even know how to survive on your own." I stared at him. "I guess I'm about to find out." That night I packed a backpack, 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, my toothbrush, my phone charger, and a photo of my grandmother Maggie that I kept in my nightstand. I walked down the hallway toward the front door. My mother stood there waiting. Her arms were crossed. "If you leave," she said quietly, "you're dead to us." My father stood behind her. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. I opened the door. Cool night air rushed inside. For a moment I hesitated. This was the house I had grown up in. The place where every childhood memory lived. But it was also the place where my future had been quietly suffocated. So I stepped outside. The screen door slammed behind me. As I walked down the driveway, I pulled out my phone. A habit more than anything. I opened my banking app. The screen loaded slowly. Then the balance appeared. Then, for a moment I thought it had to be a mistake. I refreshed the page. Same number. Every paycheck from the diner. Every tip, every dollar I had saved for years. Gone. My mother had been on the account since I was 16. She didn't need my permission to withdraw the money. I walked back toward the house. The porch light turned on. My father stood behind the screen door. "My birth certificate," I said. "And my social security card. They belong to this household," he replied. Then he closed the door. Just like that. I stood there for a few seconds. Then I turned around and walked back down the driveway. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I had a backpack, a phone with 12% battery, and $11 in my pocket. No job, no documents, no place to sleep. I walked to the gas station on Route 30 and sat on the curb under the fluorescent lights. Cars came and went. No one paid attention to me. Around midnight my phone buzzed. A text from my father. "Come home, apologize. I might reconsider things." I stared at the message. Then I turned the phone off. Not because I was brave, because the battery was almost dead anyway. But for the first time in my life, no one was telling me where to go. The first night outside my parents' house felt unreal. I sat on the curb outside the gas station on Route 30. Watching the fluorescent lights flicker above me, cars came and went. People walked inside to buy coffee or cigarettes. No one paid attention to the girl sitting outside with a backpack. That was the strange thing about becoming invisible. It happened faster than you would expect. Just a few hours earlier, I had still been someone's daughter living in a quiet house on Maple Street. Now I was just another person sitting under a streetlight with nowhere to go. Around 2 in the morning, the gas station cashier stepped outside to take out the trash. He looked at me for a moment, not suspicious, just curious. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said automatically. He nodded slowly like he didn't quite believe me, but he didn't ask more questions. That was the first lesson I learned that night. Most people don't want to know the full story. They just want to make sure you're not about to cause trouble. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I wasn't going back. Not for an apology. Not for my documents. Not for anything. If my parents believed I couldn't survive without them, I was going to prove them wrong. The first step was finding somewhere to sleep. I spent the morning walking through town asking about cheap rooms or temporary housing. Everywhere I went, no vacancies. Try again next week. Sorry, we can't help. Around noon, the same gas station cashier from the night before noticed me again. "You're still here," he said. "Yeah." He leaned on the counter. "There's a shelter about 5 blocks from here," he said quietly. "Old warehouse building on Mill Street." He grabbed a napkin and wrote down the address. "Ask for Linda," he added. I thanked him and left before my pride could convince me not to go. The Harlan Community Shelter looked exactly like what it used to be, an old storage warehouse that someone had converted into a temporary living space. Inside, rows of metal beds filled the large room. The air smelled like disinfectant and reheated soup. A woman with short brown hair sat behind a folding table near the entrance. She looked up when I walked in. "You looking for a bed?" she asked. "Yes." She studied me for a moment. "You don't look like most of the people who come here." "I guess that makes 2 of us," I replied. She smiled slightly. "Name's Linda?" she said. "Caroline." Linda handed me a clipboard with a few basic forms. "No one here needs to explain their entire life story," she said. "We just need enough information to help." I filled out the paperwork and followed her across the room. "Bed 14, she said, pointing to a metal frame near the wall. The mattress was thin, but it was a place to sleep. That night, lying on that narrow bed under the buzzing fluorescent lights, I kept thinking about my parents. Not with anger. With confusion. Why would they go so far to stop me from leaving? They had drained my bank account, kept my documents, destroyed my chances of getting hired, and still they expected me to come home and apologize. It didn't make sense. The next morning, I walked to the library again. I needed to start rebuilding my life. First step: replace my documents, birth certificate, social security card. Without those, finding a job would be nearly impossible. The clerk at the records office explained the process. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. That's the normal processing time. 6 to 8 weeks felt like an eternity. But I didn't have a choice. Over the next few days, I focused on surviving. I helped clean the shelter kitchen in exchange for extra meals. I swept floors, sorted donated clothes. Anything that made me feel useful. But every time I applied for a job, the same thing kept happening. Employers suddenly stopped returning calls. Interviews were canceled. Managers lost interest overnight. At first I tried to convince myself it was just bad luck. But deep down I knew better. My parents were still interfering, even from miles away. One afternoon, about a week after arriving at the shelter, Linda stopped me while I was organizing supplies in the storage room. "Caroline," she said, "did you have someone come by asking about you last week?" I frowned. "No." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small business card. "A woman came here asking if you were staying with us," she explained. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," Linda replied. "We don't give out information about residents." I took the card. The words printed on it made my heart skip. Ruth Callan, licensed private investigator. A private investigator. My first thought was obvious. My parents had hired someone to find me, track me down, maybe even drag me back home. "What did she look like?" I asked. "Older," Linda said, "maybe in her 50s. Short gray hair. Seemed polite. That didn't sound like someone my parents would hire. They preferred people who worked quietly in the background." This woman had walked straight to the front desk and asked for me by name. I turned the card over in my hands. There was a phone number on the back. "Did she say why she was looking for me?" I asked. Linda shook her head. "Just said it was important." For the rest of the day, the card stayed in my pocket. Every time I touched it, the same thought came back. Who would hire a private investigator to look for me? My parents certainly wouldn't. They already knew exactly where I was supposed to be. At home, under their control. That night, lying on bed 14, I stared at the ceiling for hours. My grandmother Maggie had once said something strange to me a year before she died. We had been sitting on her old farm porch, watching the sunset. "If things ever get really bad," she told me, "someone will come find you." At the time I had laughed. But now, lying in a shelter with a private investigator's card in my pocket, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. And for the first time since leaving home, I started to wonder if my grandmother had been planning something long before I even knew I needed help. For 2 days, I carried the private investigator's business card everywhere. It stayed in the front pocket of my jeans. I touched it constantly, almost without realizing it. Part of me wanted to call the number immediately. Another part of me was terrified. Because there were only 2 possibilities. Either my parents had hired someone to track me down, or someone else had been watching everything that had happened to me. Neither option made me feel comfortable. By the 3rd night, curiosity won. The shelter had quiet hours after 10. Most people were already asleep. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the rows of beds. I stepped outside with my phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice, then a calm voice answered. "Ruth Callan." My throat tightened slightly. "Hi, my name is Caroline Johansson." There was a brief pause. Then the woman spoke again. "I've been hoping you would call." Something in her tone immediately eased my nerves. Not excitement, not urgency, just quiet certainty. "How did you know where I was?" I asked. "I'll explain that," she said. "But I'd rather do it in person." We agreed to meet the next morning at a small coffee shop in Millfield. I barely slept that night. My mind kept racing through possibilities. What if she worked for my parents? What if this was another attempt to control me? But something about her voice didn't match that idea. It sounded patient. The next morning, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. It was a small place with wooden tables and the smell of fresh pastries in the air. A woman with short gray hair sat near the window. A brown leather briefcase rested beside her chair. She looked up when I walked in. "Caroline?" she asked. "Yes." She stood and shook my hand. "Ruth Callan." Her handshake was firm but gentle. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. I nodded, still unsure what to expect. After we sat down, she opened the briefcase. Inside were several neatly organized folders. But before showing them to me, she asked one question. "Do you remember your grandmother Margaret Johansson?" My chest tightened instantly. "Of course I do." Ruth nodded. "She hired me." The words took a moment to process. My grandmother hired a private investigator. 10 years ago. I stared at her. "That doesn't make sense." "She was worried about you," Ruth said calmly. "She believed your parents would eventually try to control your life in ways that might harm you." I leaned back in my chair. 10 years ago, I would have been 18. Just finishing high school. She asked me to monitor certain things. Ruth continued. Phone calls, emails, financial activity. You've been watching my parents for 10 years, she said, but periodically. Then she slid the first folder across the table. Until about 3 years ago, I opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed transcripts, call logs, dates, phone numbers. Each page documented a phone call my mother had made to one of my potential employers. Millfield Hardware, Ridgeway Market, Cooperton Diner. 37 calls in total. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the pages. Every single accusation my mother had made was written down. Claims that I was violent, unstable, dangerous. This can't be real, I whispered. Oh, it's real? Ruth said. And that's only part of it? She opened another folder. Inside were printed emails. Some looked official, documents formatted like police reports, fake background checks. Every one of them had been sent anonymously to companies I applied to. But Ruth had traced them back to their source. The IP address matched my parents' house. My father had created the documents, carefully formatted them, then sent them out to ruin my reputation. For a moment, I couldn't speak. 3 years. 3 years of systematic sabotage. And your grandmother suspected all of this? I asked. She suspected your father's behavior would escalate, Ruth replied. She told me once that Gerald Johansson believes control is the same thing as love. That sounded painfully accurate. Ruth closed the folders and looked at me. Your grandmother left something else for you, she said. She reached into the briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front, in familiar handwriting. Grandma Maggie's. My eyes blurred instantly. She instructed me to deliver this if things ever became serious, Ruth explained. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a short handwritten letter. Caroline, if you're reading this, it means your father has gone too far. I tried to stop him while I was alive. But some men never change. Inside Ruth's briefcase is everything you need to prove the truth. Use it wisely. Don't use it for revenge. Use it to build your freedom. Love always, Grandma Maggie. I lowered the letter slowly. The world suddenly felt different. For months, I had felt powerless, trapped, alone. But sitting across from me was proof that someone had believed in me long before things fell apart. My grandmother had seen the danger years earlier, and she had made a plan. Ruth closed the briefcase. There's one more thing, she said. What? She slid another document toward me. Legal paperwork, trust documents, financial statements. The number printed at the bottom made my heart skip. $340,000. That money belongs to you, Ruth said. Your grandmother created a trust before she died. I stared at the number. She knew your father would try to control any money you had, Ruth explained. So she made sure he would never be able to touch it. For the first time since leaving home, I realized something important. My parents had spent years trying to trap me, but my grandmother had spent years quietly building my escape. And with the evidence sitting in that briefcase, I finally had the power to fight back. For the first time since I left my parents' house, I didn't feel powerless. I felt focused. The folders inside Ruth's briefcase contained everything my parents had done for the past 3 years. Phone calls, emails, fake documents, proof that they had systematically destroyed every opportunity I tried to build. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Evidence needed someone who knew how to use it. That's why Ruth had one more stop planned for that day. Before your grandmother passed away, she said as we walked out of the coffee shop, she made arrangements with a lawyer. A lawyer? I asked. Ruth nodded. She believed you might need legal help someday. We drove to a small office building in Millfield. It was above a hardware store on the town's main street. A brass plaque beside the door read, Ellen Briggs, Civil Litigation. Ruth knocked once and pushed the door open. The office inside was quiet and organized. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal volumes. A woman in a gray blazer sat behind a desk, reviewing a stack of paperwork. She looked up as we entered. "You must be Caroline," she said. Her voice was calm and confident. "Wes, I'm Ellen Briggs." She stood and shook my hand. "I've been expecting you." That sentence made my stomach tighten slightly. "My grandmother arranged this too?" I asked. Ellen smiled faintly. "Your grandmother was a very thoughtful woman." She gestured toward 2 chairs across from her desk. "Please sit." Ruth placed the briefcase on the desk and opened it. One by one, she handed the folders to Ellen. The lawyer began reading silently. The room stayed quiet except for the soft sound of pages turning. Every few minutes, Ellen made a small note on a yellow legal pad. After nearly 20 minutes, she leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said. "That's extensive." "Is it enough?" I asked. Ellen folded her hands together. "More than enough." Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. "Enough for what?" I asked carefully. Ellen looked directly at me. "To file a lawsuit against your parents." The words hung in the air. Lawsuit, my parents. Even after everything they had done, the idea still felt strange. "They're my family," I said quietly. Ellen nodded. "I understand. But what they did isn't just cruel," she continued. "It's illegal?" She pointed to one of the folders. "Your mother impersonated a social worker in one of these calls." She tapped another document. "Your father created falsified reports to damage your reputation." Then she looked back at me. "That's defamation and interference with employment opportunities." I stared down at the papers on the desk. 3 years of sabotage, 3 years of lies. Ellen said, "We can demand compensation for the income you lost." "How much?" I asked. She shrugged slightly. "That depends on how the court calculates the damages. But it could easily be tens of thousands of dollars." The number barely registered. This wasn't about money. It was about something much deeper. "My parents think they were protecting me?" I said. Ellen shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "They were controlling you." The difference between those 2 words felt enormous. For years, my parents had insisted everything they did was for my safety. But sitting in that office, surrounded by evidence of their actions, the truth was impossible to ignore. "They wanted you dependent," Ellen continued. "Dependent people are easier to control." Silence filled the room. Finally, Ellen slid a sheet of paper toward me. "If you want to proceed," she said, "I'll prepare the lawsuit." My hand hovered over the document. For a moment I imagined my parents opening a court summons, seeing their names listed as defendants. Hearing a judge read their actions out loud, the idea felt unreal. Then I remembered the notebook. The red check marks, 37 phone calls, 3 years of my life erased. I picked up the pen and signed the paper. Ellen nodded once. "I'll file the case this week." "What happens after that?" I asked. "Your parents will be served with the lawsuit," she explained. "They'll have a chance to respond. And if they deny everything," Ellen tapped the stack of evidence, "then we take them to court." The thought sent a strange mix of nerves and determination through my chest. "Good," I said quietly. Ruth closed the briefcase and stood up. "You're doing the right thing," she told me. I wasn't sure about that yet. But I knew one thing for certain. For the first time in years, my parents were about to face consequences. 3 days later, the lawsuit was officially filed, and early Monday morning, a court officer walked up the driveway of my parents' house. He rang the doorbell. My father answered, and for the first time in his life, someone handed him a document he couldn't control. 3 days after Ellen filed the lawsuit, the entire town of Harlan knew about it. That's the strange thing about small towns. Secrets don't stay secret for very long. The court officer served my father early Monday morning while he was checking the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Mrs. Patterson from the post office happened to be watering her flowers across the street. By lunchtime, she had told 2 neighbors. By dinner, half the town had heard. My father called me 9 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. Ellen had been very clear about that. From now on, she said, all communication goes through me. At 70:12 that evening, my phone buzzed again. A text message, "You're making a terrible mistake." I stared at the words for a long time. Then another message appeared. "You're destroying this family." I took a screenshot and sent it to Ellen. Her response came 5 minutes later. "Perfect. Keep everything. That was the new rule. Every message, every call, every threat. Document everything." Because in a courtroom, proof mattered more than emotion. Over the next few weeks, Ellen began building the case piece by piece. The evidence Ruth had gathered was already strong, but Ellen wanted more. She wanted witnesses. "People trust documents," she explained. "But they believe stories." The first person she contacted was Bill, the manager from the hardware store where I had my first interview. I was nervous when we met him. Part of me still felt embarrassed about everything that had happened. But Bill greeted us kindly. "I wondered what happened to you," he said. Ellen explained the situation. Bill listened quietly. Then he shook his head. "That phone call seemed strange even back then," he admitted. "Strange how?" Ellen asked. The woman sounded rehearsed, like she had practiced what she was going to say. Bill agreed to provide a written statement. One witness. Next, Ellen contacted Carol from the Ridgeway grocery store. Carol had saved the voicemail my mother left. Hearing it again made my stomach twist. My mother's voice sounded calm, concerned, almost convincing. "I just wanted to warn you about Caroline Johansson," she said in the recording. "She has a history of violent behavior." Carol testified that the message had influenced her hiring decision. 2 witnesses. Then came Pat, the diner owner in Cooperton. Pat didn't just remember the call. She had written down the date and time in a small notebook she kept near the register. "Something about that woman bothered me," she said. "She sounded too eager to ruin your reputation." 3 witnesses. By the end of the second week, Ellen had gathered statements from 5 different employers. Every single one confirmed the same thing. Someone had contacted them before my interviews. Someone claiming to know me personally. Someone warning them not to hire me. But Ellen wasn't finished. She wanted to prove that the emails with the fake police reports came from my parents' house. That's where Ruth's investigation became critical. The anonymous emails had been sent through a free account, but the metadata still contained traces of the original network, an internet address. And that address matched the one registered to my parents' home. My father had tried to cover his tracks, but he wasn't nearly as clever as he thought. Ellen organized the evidence into a timeline: phone calls, emails, job applications, rejections, 37 separate acts of sabotage. Seeing it all laid out like that was overwhelming. 3 years of my life reduced to a series of deliberate attacks. But the case wasn't just about the past. It was also about the present. Because my father wasn't staying quiet. He had begun telling his own version of the story around town. According to him, I had been manipulated by outsiders, lawyers, investigators, anyone who wasn't part of the family. At the next town council meeting, he even stood up and gave a speech. "I'm a father trying to protect my daughter," he told the room. "My daughter has fallen into bad company." The crowd listened politely. Some people nodded sympathetically. That's how my father had always operated. He knew how to appear reasonable, how to make himself sound like the victim. But this time was different. Because Ellen had already filed the evidence with the county court. And court records in Ohio were public. Anyone in Harland could look them up. Within days, copies of the complaint started circulating. People read about the phone calls, the fabricated documents, the impersonation of a social worker. For the first time, the story my father was telling didn't quite match the facts. One afternoon, Ellen called me into her office. "I think we're ready," she said. "For what?" "For court." She slid a thick folder across the desk. Inside were the witness statements, the recordings, the email records, the investigation reports. Months of preparation, all leading to one moment. "When the judge sees this," Ellen said, "your parents won't be able to deny what they did." I closed the folder slowly. Part of me still felt nervous. But another part felt something else. Something stronger. For years, my parents had controlled the story about me. They decided what people believed. They decided what opportunities I lost. But now the truth had a voice, and in a courtroom, the truth would finally be heard. The Harlan Council meeting was usually a quiet affair. Most months, only a dozen people showed up. Retired neighbors complaining about potholes. Local business owners asking about permits. The kind of meeting where nothing important ever really happened. But the night my father decided to speak again, the room was full. Every chair was taken. People lined the back wall. Some even stood near the doorway. By then, everyone in town had heard about the lawsuit. The official court documents had spread through Harlan faster than gossip ever could. 37 phone calls, fabricated police reports, 3 years of sabotage. For the first time, the story my father had been telling didn't sound quite so convincing. I arrived early with Ellen. We sat in the third row, not the back, not hiding. Right in the middle of the room, Ellen wore a gray blazer and carried a small legal pad. She looked calm, like this was just another ordinary evening. I wished I felt the same way. My father arrived 10 minutes later. He walked into the room with the same confidence he always carried. Like he expected everyone to believe him. My mother followed close behind. Her eyes were already red, as if she had been crying. They sat in the front row. My father didn't look at me. But I could feel the tension building in the room. At exactly 70:00 p.m., the council chair called the meeting to order. The first few agenda items passed quickly: budget, updates, road maintenance, the usual routine. Then the public comment portion began. My father stood up immediately. He walked to the podium with slow, deliberate steps. For a moment, the room went completely silent. Everyone was waiting. "My name is Gerald Johansson," he began. His voice carried easily through the microphone. "I've lived in Harlan my entire life." A few people nodded. "That's true." Someone whispered near the back. "My daughter has recently filed a lawsuit against her own parents," my father continued. He paused dramatically. "I want this community to understand what's really happening." He glanced toward me briefly. Just long enough to make sure everyone noticed. "My daughter has been influenced by outsiders," he said. "People who don't understand our family." His voice grew more emotional. "I've spent my entire life trying to protect her." My mother lowered her head and wiped her eyes. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This was the version of the story my father wanted them to believe. A loving parent. A misguided daughter. But this time, something was different. People had already read the court documents. They knew about the phone calls, the fake reports, the emails, and the room didn't react the way my father expected. Instead of sympathy, there was silence. Heavy silence. My father cleared his throat. "I'm asking this community to stand with me," he said, "to help bring my daughter home." No one moved. No one spoke. The council chair looked uncertain. Finally, Ellen stood up. "My name is Ellen Briggs," she said calmly. "I'm an attorney licensed in the state of Ohio." Her voice was steady, clear. "I represent Caroline Johansson." Several heads turned toward her. Ellen continued. "The lawsuit filed in county court contains documented evidence of 37 separate attempts to interfere with Caroline's employment." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone directly. She simply stated the facts. "All supporting evidence is part of the public record," she added. "Anyone who wishes to review it can access those documents through the county court website." The room stayed quiet. But this time, the silence felt different. People were thinking, processing, comparing what they had read with what my father was saying. My father's confidence began to fade. He gripped the edges of the podium. "You're twisting things," he said. "No," Ellen replied calmly. "I'm clarifying them." The council chair cleared his throat nervously. "I think we should move on to the next agenda item." My father stood there for a moment longer. Then he stepped away from the microphone. He returned to his seat without saying another word. For the rest of the meeting, the tension in the room never faded. When the session ended, people slowly began filing toward the exit. Several of them glanced at me, not with suspicion, with curiosity. A few even nodded politely. That was new. For months, I had been the girl everyone whispered about. the one who had supposedly caused trouble for her own family. But now the story was changing. Outside the building, the cool evening air felt refreshing. Ellen closed her legal pad and looked at me. "That went well," she said. "I wasn't so sure." "My father still thinks he can control the narrative," I said. "He can try," Ellen replied. "But the facts are already in the court system." And facts had a way of spreading. Over the next few days, conversations around town began to shift. At the diner, at the grocery store, at the post office, people were talking about the evidence, about the phone calls, about the fake documents. Some of them even started asking my parents difficult questions. Questions they couldn't easily answer. One afternoon, Tom Adler, my father's neighbor of 30 years, knocked on their door. "Jerry," he said when my father answered, "I read the court filings." My father crossed his arms. "People misunderstand things." Tom shook his head slowly. "Did you really fake a police report about your own daughter?" My father didn't answer. He simply closed the door. But by then, the damage had already begun. Because once the truth enters a small town, it doesn't disappear. It spreads. And soon, everyone in Harland was waiting for the same thing. The day the case finally reached the courtroom. The day the judge would hear the evidence. The day one email, hidden for 3 years, would finally be read aloud. And when that happened, my parents wouldn't be able to control the story anymore. The courthouse in Millfield was older than most of the buildings in town. Red brick, tall windows, polished wooden floors that echoed with every step. I arrived early that morning with Ellen. The hallway outside the courtroom was already crowded. Some of the people standing there were witnesses. Others were just curious. In a small town, a lawsuit between parents and their daughter was the kind of story people couldn't ignore. My parents arrived 15 minutes later. My father walked ahead of my mother, his posture stiff and determined. He still looked confident, like he believed this was all just a misunderstanding that would eventually disappear. My mother avoided looking at me entirely. The courtroom doors opened at 90 m. We all filed inside. The room smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. The judge entered a few minutes later, a tall woman with silver hair and a calm expression. Everyone stood. Then the case began. Ellen spoke first. She presented the timeline of events clearly and calmly. 37 phone calls to potential employers, 5 fabricated documents that resembled police reports, anonymous emails sent to hiring managers, 3 years of interference with my ability to find work. Every piece of evidence was supported by documents, witness statements, recordings, digital records. My father's expression slowly changed as Ellen spoke. At first he looked irritated, then uneasy. By the time the witnesses began testifying, he looked genuinely nervous. Bill from the hardware store described the phone call he received warning him about me. Carol from the grocery store played the voicemail my mother had left. Pat from the diner explained how the accusations had influenced her decision not to hire me. Each testimony added another piece to the picture. A pattern. A deliberate effort to destroy my reputation. When the witnesses finished, the judge turned to my parents. "Do you wish to respond?" she asked. My father stood up. "Yes, Your Honor." He walked to the front of the room. "This situation has been misunderstood," he said. "I was simply trying to protect my daughter." A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. The judge remained expressionless. "And the fabricated documents?" she asked. My father hesitated. "I don't know anything about those." "And the phone calls?" "Concerned neighbors," he replied quickly. The answer sounded weak even to my ears. The judge nodded slowly, then she turned toward Ellen. "Is there anything further?" Ellen stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She walked to the evidence table and opened a folder. "This case includes one final piece of documentation." My father's eyes followed her movements carefully. Ellen lifted a printed page from the folder. "This is an email sent from an anonymous account to several employers who had scheduled interviews with Caroline Johansson." She handed a copy to the judge. The courtroom was silent. Then Ellen began reading. "To whom it may concern, I strongly advise against hiring Caroline Johansson. She has a history of violent behavior and legal problems. Hiring her could put your staff at risk. My father shifted in his seat. But Ellen continued. I'm saying this as someone who knows her personally. Then she paused. She looked up from the paper. Would you like me to read the rest of the email, Your Honor? The judge nodded. Ellen lowered her eyes to the page again. As her father, I feel responsible for warning people before she causes harm somewhere else. The words seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom felt completely still. My father's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because the email didn't just accuse me, it identified him. He had written it himself. Signed it. Sent it anonymously to employers. But he had forgotten one thing: digital records. The email had been traced back to the internet connection inside our house. Ellen placed the paper on the evidence table. This message was sent from the defendant's home network, she said calmly. The sender identified himself as Caroline Johansson's father. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My father stared down at the floor. The judge looked at him carefully. Mr. Johansson, she said, do you dispute sending this email? My father didn't answer. The silence lasted nearly 10 seconds. Finally, he shook his head slightly. No. The admission was quiet. But it changed everything. Because in that moment, the case stopped being a question and became a fact. The judge reviewed the documents in front of her for several minutes. Then she spoke. The evidence presented in this case clearly demonstrates a pattern of defamation and intentional interference with employment. She looked directly at my parents. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge continued. The defendants are ordered to pay damages totaling $85,000. My father's shoulders slumped. The judge raised one final point. And due to repeated attempts to contact the plaintiff after legal warnings were issued, this court grants a civil protection order. She looked at my parents again. You are prohibited from contacting Caroline Johansson directly or indirectly. The gavel struck the desk once. The case was over. People began standing and gathering their belongings. But for a moment, I stayed seated. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I was tired. 3 years of lies. Months of preparation. And everything had ended with one email. As Ellen gathered the documents, she glanced at me. You did well, she said quietly. Across the room, my parents were already leaving. My father didn't look back. My mother hesitated for a moment. Then she followed him out the door. For the first time in years, they had nothing left to say. When the courtroom emptied that morning, something inside me felt strangely quiet, not victorious, not angry, just peaceful. For 3 years, my parents had controlled every part of my life. Where I worked, where I went, what people believed about me. They had turned my reputation into a weapon, but now the truth was part of the public record, and truth has a way of traveling. Especially in a small town. Within a week, everyone in Harlan knew what had happened in that courtroom. They knew about the phone calls, the fake police reports, the emails, the story my father had spent years telling about a daughter who couldn't be trusted no longer made sense. The judgment against my parents didn't just exist on paper. It followed them everywhere. My mother stopped attending the church volunteer meetings. No one told her not to come. She just stopped showing up. My father stopped visiting the coffee shop on Main Street where he used to sit every morning. The booth was still there, but the conversations had changed. People talk differently when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The financial part of the judgment came next. My parents didn't have $85,000 sitting in a bank account, which meant the court allowed Ellen to file a lien on the house. The same house on Maple Street where I had grown up. The same house where my parents had believed they controlled everything. 6 months later, the house was sold. After paying the court judgment and the remaining debts, my parents moved to a small trailer park outside Galion. A quiet place where no one knew their history. Some people might call that revenge. But it didn't feel like revenge to me. It felt like consequences. Meanwhile, my life slowly began rebuilding itself. With the trust my grandmother had created, I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Millfield. Nothing fancy. Just a kitchen, a couch, and a door that locked. But it was mine. I bought a used Honda Civic with more miles on it than I could count. It rattled a little when I drove faster than 60. But it started every morning. And that was enough. Philip Dern, the lawyer who managed my grandmother's trust, offered me a job as an administrative assistant at his office. Apparently, organizing all the evidence for my case had impressed him. It wasn't a glamorous job. But it was steady. And for the first time in my life, my paycheck belonged only to me. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit at the small kitchen table in my apartment with a cup of coffee and think about my grandmother Maggie. She had seen the danger long before I did. 10 years earlier, she had quietly hired a private investigator. She had built a safety net, a plan, not to help me take revenge, but to make sure I would always have a way out. That's the part of the story that matters most. Real love doesn't trap you. It doesn't sabotage your future. Real love prepares you to be free. I haven't spoken to my parents since the trial. Maybe someday that will change. Maybe it won't. But one thing is certain. The door to my life is no longer theirs to open or close. That choice belongs to me now. And it all began with one email they thought no one would ever read. One email that finally told the truth.